Welcome to Roadie Wellness, where we explore all things health and self-care. Whether you're seeking mental clarity, physical fitness, or insight from students like you, we've got you covered. Hello and welcome back to the Roadie Wellness podcast. I'm Olivia and I'm here with
Kelli Kidd, URI nutrition specialist.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited about this topic. We're going to be talking about the freshman 15, or what it really is, all the nutrition myths and fad diets that are very popular in colleges and in college-aged students, and just talking about sustainable eating habits and promoting a healthy diet. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
I am so excited to be here and talk about a topic that comes up a lot in what I do.
Yeah, I can imagine. So starting off, what is the freshman 15? If you can just give us like a general definition of it.
So it's basically a term that got coined in the late 80s through a magazine called 17, where they were just putting together a catchy title and then, kind of looking at the transformation of the articles that they put forth. In the late 70s, their title was How to Avoid Freshman Weight Gain, and then that progressed to Fight Freshman Fat a few years later. And then in 1988, they coined the term Fighting the Freshman 15, and then that just stuck.
Interesting. That is not where I thought that came from.
Yeah, correct. So, I think it's great that we're talking about it today, about, what happens when we go to new locations, right? And there may be a body composition or weight adjustment when freshmen start at college, but the research that has been done shows it's much lower. Typically, if there's a gain, and there's not always a gain, but if there is, it's more along the lines of about 2 to maybe 5 pounds.
So that is a lot different than 15. That is, a major difference than that. So that's, yeah.
Correct.
Those marketing gimmicks will really get you in those magazines.
And it was way catchier to go with freshman 15, and it caught the attention for many years now.
Yeah, I mean, if it's still very popular today, even on TikTok, I see it a lot among students who are already in college, but especially seniors who are going to be going into college, and everyone wants tips about how to avoid it and all these things, and I think that's where a lot of these myths and things come about. I guess going off of that, why is it common for students' weight to fluctuate? Even though it's only a 2 to 5 pound difference, there is still a fluctuation, so why does that happen?
I think just coming to a new eating environment, for many people it's the first time that they're navigating an eating situation on their own without the support of, usually it's a family support. So I think that there's just some cases learning how to do that, seeing what is available around where they are. So typically a dining hall experience, you can navigate through that very well, but sometimes people don't know how to do it, so there has to be an education with that. Sometimes it's inconsistent eating schedules where maybe timing and composition of meals and snacks looks much different, and that has an impact. In some cases, there may be other activities where there's easy to access high-calorie options. I would say one of the biggest things I see are beverages. Students relying on things like energy drinks or flavored coffees or like the Raz Bowls or the refreshers. And those end up providing a lot of calories which without much satiation or that full feeling. And sometimes they don't realize it. In some instances, things like late-night snacking or potentially some addition of alcohol or situations that might lead to mindless eating can contribute as well.
Yeah, definitely a lot of adjustments that students have to face when they come to college, especially with their eating habits. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. Going back to what I said before with the freshman 15 and seeing it on TikTok and a lot of fad diets emerging because of this fear almost of avoiding the freshman 15 in quotes, of course. What are some that you see regularly, and what are your thoughts about them?
So typically if a student comes in and they're their quote is, I saw this on TikTok, I wait to hear if they followed up with that they researched it further, or I commend them for researching it further by coming in to see a professional. Many of the trends involve some form of extreme calorie restriction. Currently it's things like the carnivore diet or juice fasting, intermittent fasting could fit into that category as well. having them know kind of the potential consequences and how that may impact their overall health is something that we aim to talk through. Generally, with a fad diet, indications that it might not be evidence-based will be, especially if they're trying to sell you something, looking at the person's credential if possible. So if it's just an influencer, somebody that doesn't have any background in nutrition, that's a huge red flag. Because everybody eats, everybody thinks that they are an expert on nutrition, and many times they don't know the second and third order consequences. And another indication that an eating plan might be more of a fad diet than evidence-based would be if there is a big emphasis on good foods or bad foods, or foods that are allowed or not allowed. Because with that, when individuals label their foods, sometimes that carries over to themselves. They think that they ate a quote-unquote bad food, that they must be bad. And then this kind of starts this black or white, all or nothing thinking, which then sometimes leads to even more inconsistent eating, where they might just try to stay very quote-unquote good and really restrict to what they think is on this good list. And then that sets them up potentially for days where they're having bad foods, or if they have one quote-unquote bad food, that spirals into, well, I went off my diet and then I'm just going to keep going with it, versus having a more balanced approach that we're going to incorporate in some of what we call fun foods on a regular basis, so it doesn't have that power over them. Those are some of the big things that we look out for. I would say some form of a very high protein diet to the point that it's excluding entire food groups has just been a continued trend, since before I even went to college.
Are there any other eating habits that you see that might be problematic or not sustainable?
A trend that I have seen since I became a dietitian, and I used to call it the work person's eating pattern, and then I think that maybe it starts in a college setting or maybe before, but the eating pattern that often leads to inconsistent eating and often lends itself to undesired body composition changes is one where somebody is very rushed in the morning for whatever reason, or they're not hungry, and the first time that they end up having something to eat is often late afternoon or early evening, and by that time an entire day's worth of nutrition is needed, and the survival part of our brain is just basically signaling to that person that they need to fill their fuel tank, and often that results in a very large quantity of food being consumed because they didn't disperse it throughout the day. So it ends up being this very lopsided eating pattern that's way too much at a time when they're less active. Typically, later in the evening, they wake up in the morning not hungry and they don't have fuel at the times that they would most need it. So that pattern often leads to those undesired changes.
So I know you were talking previously about an inconsistent eating schedule causing weight fluctuations. Is that like skipping breakfast almost and eating later? Is that one of the causes you would say of weight gain, or a potential cause, I should specify?
I caveat everything by I have everybody be their own detective and investigate for themselves. So frequently when people miss those early morning feeding opportunities, that excessive hunger that results creates a situation where they're more likely to seek out foods that are going to be quickly consumed, quickly utilized as a fuel source, which tend to be more sugary kind of processed things, because the brain knows that that's going to be a very fast fuel option. So I often see that. It doesn't mean that if somebody doesn't have breakfast, that's automatically going to happen. But if that is the eating pattern that they describe, we definitely do more investigating, and I have them do more self-observation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually think I'm guilty of that, where I'm rushed out and then, I come back later and I'm so hungry I just reach for whatever is the easiest and quickest option, which you're right is almost always a processed food that's probably high in calories and not the best for me. So yeah, I can definitely see how that can be a factor in that, or play a role in that. So now that we talked about fad diets and some unhealthy habits, what are your tips for students who want to maintain their weight, or they may have a weight goal, whether that's losing weight or gaining weight? What are some sustainable ways that they can monitor their weight and change it if needed?
Absolutely. And, kind of going back to the idea where they're going to do the self-observation, one of the very easiest things they can do is literally just like on a notebook or in their phone on the notes, put down, and not necessarily tracking calories or macros, but just write down or list what their day looks like. I also try to teach them a tool for monitoring hunger and fullness so they can determine if what we're putting together is holding them until that next opportunity that they have to eat. The general eating pattern is somewhere between having something about every 3 to 5 hours throughout the primarily daylight hours, and then aiming with that hunger and fullness scale to start at what we'll call a 3, ready to eat, not getting down to the absolute starving range of 0, where somebody's like lightheaded, shaky, hangry, and then stopping at what we'll call a 7, satisfied, but not getting to the point where they're so uncomfortably full that it's what we'd call as stuffed. And then I have them realize that there's a time lag when their brain and gut communicate, and they estimate it's about 20 minutes or so. So in those situations where maybe for whatever reason eating didn't happen until much later and somebody's at that starving point, often that survival part of our brain is prompting us to go find fuel, something quick. That's typically why it's something, kind of more sugar-based or something that's going to be a really fast fuel option. We can talk later about no good or bad foods, but that's typically why that's what we seek out. And we eat very quickly because the brain's trying to refill that tank. So often then we'll end up at that 10 if we've gotten too hungry. And then people end up having that day be very lopsided if that's the situation. So if they're monitoring how they're feeling with that goal of starting at a 3 and ending at a 7, they can see where maybe they deviated from that. And then we can strategize ways that we can have options either pre-positioned with them or opportunities to get that next meal or what I call complete snack that includes a little bit of protein to help with that satiety factor.
You mentioned writing down when you eat in your notes app, for example. So once you do that, how can you use that to evaluate or observe yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I also try to teach them is just the basics of what you're trying to have your plate look like or include in a meal or a snack. And we go through anchoring things with some protein, not necessarily a high protein, but definitely including it regularly throughout the day. And we go through multiple options because everybody has different preferences. And we can make that be plant-based or animal-based or, just going again with what's available or maybe budget friendly. Then we talk about all of the options within carbohydrates, and then I make it a very big point that it's not just breads, grains, cereals, starches, it's also fruits and vegetables that fit into that carbohydrate category. Dairy would fit in there too. It would also have some protein, and then added sugar. And then within those choices, we divide that up and just try to make sure that each meal has some natural color with either a fruit or a vegetable. So once they have kind of that visual, then they can, just monitor to see if their plate actually had it at a meal. And then the snacks that they're having, did they include some protein? And then what they had, did that hold them throughout the day? So just them monitoring the timing and just what it looked like. As I mentioned before, typically the liquid options tend to be less satiating, so that will be something I would have them self-monitor for. Situations that might lend themselves to mindless eating, I have them look out for that as well. So something that I will advise them about is never to eat straight out of a package, to always put it in a bowl, a cup, a plate, and not be distracted watching a video or doing social media or even studying, trying to take 5 or 10 minutes at least to separate the two so they can be aware and thoroughly enjoy what they're eating. Because sometimes when we get into, kind of the groove of what we're doing, we lose track, especially if we had a bag of something that was designed to be very palatable and tasty. It's very easy to lose track and just have more than you meant to have. Those are just a few things that people can do anytime. I also say that we're creating kind of like a toolkit for the individual, and we have all these different options or tools that they can pull out as needed and then put back in their toolkit if they don't need it. So that's how that kind of doing their own personal food journal can work into things.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense now. Yeah, so when you track yourself, you don't only want to track when you're eating, but also what you're eating and possibly your hunger fullness scale rating as well, so you can just monitor your patterns and then adjust as needed.
Correct.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense, yeah. Expanding on what you said about the toolkit, what are some tools that you may suggest to students briefly?
Again, when somebody comes in, we're really investigating what their health and nutrition goals are, so I will tailor it specifically to what their needs are. So if they are aiming for weight gain, weight loss, I will try to give them, kind of like a evidence-based research-based summary tip sheet with the bullet points of what they're trying to accomplish. I will give them just a general snack list that includes some protein in case they need different ideas, because protein, it's hard to find when you're out and about. Most carbohydrates are everywhere. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily evil, they're just easily accessible. So sometimes we have to be very intentional with where we're getting protein or what we're having with us. So that's definitely one that I have folks keep handy. And then depending on the situation, if I identify that they need some additional support. Perhaps we identify that there's some stress eating or emotional eating, or there's a different prompt for food that isn't nutrition related. I will connect them with our campus resources to help with that stress management. If there's any food insecurity, I will make sure that they are connected with the URI food security resources like the Rhody Outpost.
Well, thank you for sharing those resources. And then finally, if students have follow-up questions or they may need some more individualistic support, is it possible for students to reach out to you and book a consultation or something like that?
Absolutely. That is the primary role of my position, is to provide nutrition counseling. So anybody that's paid their health services fee, I'm available to them. They can just schedule through their patient portal. And I'm available at Health Services Monday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Tuesdays, I am specifically available for our NCAA athletes in athletics. So they have the opportunity to see me in either location.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us and for all the wonderful information that you shared today.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks for having me.
Before we wrap up, a quick reminder that all information shared in today's podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. Thank you for listening to another episode of Rhody Wellness. If you like what you heard today, tune in every Tuesday on all podcast platforms for more. If you want to stay up to date on events and healthcare tips, please follow us at URI Health Promotions on Instagram. And if you have any ideas for future podcast episodes or more social media content that you'd like to see, please feel free to DM us or email us. Until next time, take care and stay healthy.